I've developed a new way to measure how good baseball teams are in a way that I've never seen done before. Rather than ranking teams based upon their win percentage, my method takes into account many factors such as run differential, hit differential, error differential, the quality of pitchers they've had to face, and most importantly, the quality of teams they've had to face. And I'm sure you're wondering how we do this. Well, these factors are used to calculate a score for each game that's played, and that is either added or subtracted from a team's overall score, depending on if they won or lost the game. Now, I've already mentioned that the quality of teams that they've played matters most for this calculation, and that's determined in a bit of a tricky way. This can be best described in an example. So say we want to figure out the Phillies' overall score to this point in the season. Well, we'll need to figure out the overall scores for each of their opponents at the times they played them in the season. And to figure out the overall scores for each of those teams, we'll need to figure out the overall scores for each of their opponents at the time they played them in the season. So you can see how this recursion extends infinitely. So to combat this, I put in a depth limit. So that determines how many layers of this we go deep before we just use the win percentage of the opponent to figure out a score that can then get rippled through to figure out all these calculations, which will then result in the Phillies' overall score. Hopefully that makes sense. What I found when testing this out was that once I made the depth limit high enough, the difference when I increased the depth limit to make it seemingly more accurate became almost negligible. The difference was very, very, very minimal, as it would give the same overall scores. Now, it gives a much different score depending if I set the depth limit to 1 or 2, but once it gets up to 4 or 5, there's really no difference at all, and that's what allows the computer to be able to make these calculations in quick time. If you're curious to understand more about how this code works, let me know in the comments and I might consider doing some more videos on it. Now, I found this strategy to be quite accurate because not only does it take in quite a few factors in this calculation, but it determines the scores based on the teams they played at the times they played them. So it takes into account recent trends, like was a team on a winning streak at a certain point, were they on a losing streak? Because teams change their quality as the season goes on. For instance, if you played Pittsburgh Pirates early this season, that game would count for a lot if you won it, because they were a great team. If you use their win percentage from now to calculate that score, well, they're not that good now, so the team might not get credit for taking down the really good Pirates that they were at the beginning of the season. A fun little application that I found throughout this process was that I can remove this factor of whether they win or lose to add or subtract the score, and just figure out the average overall score of each team's opponents as the season goes on. And this, well, it gave me a really interesting perspective as to which teams are actually playing their best baseball up to this point in the season, and this takes us to the Philadelphia Phillies. We all know that the Phillies are a great team. They are built for success within their lineup and their pitching rotation, and they've had success fairly recently, going to the World Series not that long ago. However, when you look at some of the off seasons that some teams in this league had, like the Yankees and the Dodgers, and even the way the Braves are built, there are other teams that we just consider to be better than the Phillies, so we have lower expectations comparatively. However, the Phillies lie atop the MLB standings, which we might not have expected, but it's a situation that we found ourselves in. And a lot of this happened over a 35-game stretch throughout April and May, where the Phillies went 29-6. Absolutely ridiculous record. However, when I run my program that tells me how difficult each team's schedule's been, not just based on the win percentage of their opponents, but based on the times at which they played them and how good they were, it tells a bit of a different story, whereas the Phillies lie at the very bottom of that list by a mile. They are consistently playing teams that are either bad or playing really poorly at the time that they play them. So if we want to break down what's actually happened during this 29-6 stretch, they started out with 3-game set against the Colorado Rockies. They won those games 2-1, 5-0, and 7-6. They played incredibly well in all 3 of them, and they really set into motion this time period in which their batters were just mashing. They move on to play the Chicago White Sox, another terrible team. We don't even need to really consider what point of the season they were at, because the White Sox are bad. And the Phillies absolutely crushed them, 7-0, 9-5, 8-2. And they just hit home run after home run after home run. It was just kind of silly to watch. They move on to a 4-game set against Cincinnati Reds, and this is where their win streak ends. They win the first one, 7-0, another huge win as the bats just pile on. But they do lose the next two games 8-1 and 7-4. So they falter a little bit. But they get right back at it, winning the last game in the 4-game set against the Reds 5-0. And so you split a 4-game set against the Reds. Now the Reds at that time were struggling a little bit, but earlier on in the season, you might remember the Reds were playing all right. So, we don't weigh those too heavily in terms of their schedule. But they move on to a series against the Padres where they just seem to hit infinite home runs. The Padres coming into this series had lost 2 out of 3 to the Blue Jays and 2 out of 4 to the Rockies, who were terrible at the time. So the Padres are a half-decent team this year, but the Phillies managed to play them at a time when they were just doing awful. And you can see the Phillies just absolutely crushing them time after time. Another home run, take an early lead in the game, and then they just pile on more home runs. This game in specific went back and forth, but they just consistently hit home runs with runners in scoring position, or runners on base at least, and extended their lead. Even though the Padres kept clawing themselves back into the game, the Phillies were just relentless. Their bats were alive at this point in time, and you can just see them absolutely letting nothing go. They move on from the Padres to a series against the Angels. Now they lose the first one 6-5, but they win the next one 7-5, and they finish up the series with a nice little 2-1 win to get the series win. The Angels, you might remember, started the season quite well, and at this point in time when they played the Phillies, they were right in the middle of their fall-off. They lost 9 of their last 10, so you can't really count those as big wins for the Phillies. And they only won 2 out of those 3. They then moved on to another team we consider to be average this season in the San Francisco Giants for a 4-game set. And they swept this 4-game set 4-3, 14-3, 5-4, and 6-1. 14-3 is a ridiculous win. And you can just see right here, the Phillies just absolutely piling on the runs. They just consistently hit extra base hits with runners on and just pound home runs. It's ridiculous. And the Giants at this point in time had just lost 2 out of 3 to Boston. So the Giants weren't playing awful, but they just lost a series. They couldn't be feeling too good about themselves. Move on to the 2-game set against the Blue Jays. Well, they beat the Blue Jays 10-1, another medium team. And you can see Bryce Harper hitting a grand slam on Jose Barrios, absolutely just annihilating the amazing start Barrios had. I honestly think this should be considered an act of war against Canada. But yeah, they do lose the next one to the Blue Jays, so they split those ones. But the Blue Jays had lost 9 out of 12 in their previous couple weeks. So Blue Jays were playing terrible, and they took advantage. Next up, they played the Marlins. Another team that's pretty consistently bad this season, has their ups and downs. The Phillies won 8-2, 8-3, and then they lost the last game 7-6. Giving up 7 runs to the Marlins is a little embarrassing. But they do win that series. And the Marlins, they're a bad team, and they just lost 2 out of 3 to the A's and swept by the Dodgers to come into this series. So you can't expect much from the Marlins. Another bunch of wins for the Phillies. The Mets then got to play the Phillies, or I should say had to play the Phillies. The Mets got beaten 3 out of 4 times by the Phillies. 5-4, 4-0, 10-5, and then the Mets managed to squeak a win against the Phillies 6-5. The Mets had come in having lost a series to the Braves, so they weren't playing their best. They're another medium, middle-of-the-pack team that were just on a bit of a downward spiral at the time that they played the Phillies, a trend that we're seeing over and over and over again. And the Phillies made the best of it. Next up, the Phillies played the Washington Nationals. They swept them 4-2, 4-3, 11-5. And they just took advantage. You can see their bats coming alive. A nice walk-off sac fly there. They're just winning games in all sorts of ways, managing to come up big. The Nats had just lost a series to the White Sox. So if you want to talk about teams that were playing bad coming in, well, losing a series to the White Sox doesn't get much worse than that. And you can see just the teams they're playing against. They just can't come up with an answer. Just pounding another 3-run shot. Just already winning 8-3, you might as well pile it on. But they go on to play the Texas Rangers. And lo and behold, another sweep. They beat the Texas Rangers 5-2, 11-4, and then 5-2 again. They just pile it on. The Rangers had been beaten a series by the Angels, beaten a series by the Guardians, and swept by the Rockies coming in. Talk about losing a series to the White Sox while getting swept by the Rockies is way more embarrassing. And the Phillies saw that, and they just cashed in. The Phillies absolutely killed the Texas Rangers. Rangers who were playing terribly at the time. They're not a bad team, but just played awful. And they capped off a 29-6 run for themselves by sweeping the Texas Rangers. It's clear to me that the Phillies haven't really been challenged based on the way fate has played out their schedule over the past month or so. They played some tougher teams at the start of the season, and they had a more mediocre record. And when you look at their schedule for later on this season, well, June's not looking that tough for them, but July, oh boy, it's a doozy. In the span of a month, the Phillies will have to take on the Cubs, the Braves, the Dodgers, the Twins, the Guardians, and the Yankees, and we'll see what this team is really made of. Do they just look great because they're feeding off of bad teams, or will we learn to discover that they are a spectacular team and they're just taking care of business with the schedule that they've been given to them? Well, time will tell, but Phillies, I'm not convinced yet. Let's see what they do.